Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Aston, and this is the Digital Project Manager Podcast. So we're always being told all the things that we should be doing, and I'm one of those people who does that. There's this pressure to improve yourself, to do things right, and actually the pressure to be seen to be doing the right things is pretty immense. But should we be doing all these things all the time? Keep listening to this episode to find out how you can save yourself a bucket load of time by cutting out or reducing some of the things from your PM routine that you might not need for every project. We're going to talk about how you can get some of your life back, spend less time in the office or at your desk by cutting out 6 things that you could save time doing. And this podcast is really about just throwing off those shackles of should and some of the musts and being a bit more efficient about the way that we do things. And today I'm joined by Patrice Embry, who's actually, and I have to laud her for this, probably the most active participant in our Slack team. And if you haven't joined yet, you could be talking to Patrice right now. If you go onto the community section of the Digital Project Manager, you can sign up there. And Patrice is nearly always there and always chatting. So she's a good person to know. And as a brief introduction, Patrice is a freelance digital PM. She's a certified Scrum Master too. She's been working in the industry for a very long time, working all different kinds of agencies and corporations. Check out some of our other podcasts to get more of an understanding of the kind of stuff that she's done. But she's worked on everything, so she's a great person to know. So welcome, Patrice.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So Patrice, can you tell us, since we last spoke, are there any interesting projects that you're working on right now?
Well, I just wrapped up an app that I was working on that helps people who are looking for short-term, really quick-hitting jobs, kind of like a care.com, but even faster, with people who need those short-term jobs done. And it was a really interesting app. It's in beta now, so it's not completely out there ready for the world to see, but it was a really interesting project because I was working with people from around the world. I'd never worked with anyone from Nigeria before, so this is my first time saying hello in Igbo, so that was a lot of fun.
That sounds like a scam project. I mean, not the thing, but yeah, there's obviously classic Nigerian scams. So was that was the development team was out there?
I'm sorry?
Was it that the development team was out there in Nigeria?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. The front-end designer was the front-end developer was in Nigeria. The back-end developer was in Mexico, and our technical lead was in Sweden. And then there was me outside of Philadelphia and the client, which was in Boston. So we were all over the place.
That is a lot of time zones to,
it is.
to work with. That must have been not fun. How did you make that work?
Well, I found a time that everyone could sort of live with, and it was 8 a.m. Eastern time. So our European friends were it was a little late in the day for them. It was pretty late for our Nigerian friend, and Mexico had to wake up a little earlier than he wanted to. So, but we made it work.
Cool. And so is this like a startup that the app's for, or is it for?
Yeah. I think it was I think it was a service that was born out of like a woman who was kind of, did this for a couple of people, and a couple of other people were like, hey, could you do that for me? And it kind of went on and on until she was like, you know what? I can't handle doing this, just coordinating this by myself anymore. And I think she was like, let's make an app for it. So it's in its really, really early infancy. So I don't want to, throw too much out there about it, but when it does go, I'll make sure to tell everyone about it, and I think it'll be a really cool service for people.
Cool. Sounds like an interesting project. What were the kind of big challenges with it that you encountered? Was it straightforward, or did you hit some rocky spots along the way?
It was a little rocky in that the client really wasn't someone who was very savvy with the computer, wasn't super savvy with apps. I mean, had your like regular, normal level of knowing how things work. But as you know, in the tech field, you tend to have a little bit of a more understanding of how things work. So it was a lot of, sort of explaining. So it would be like kind of explaining to your friend who, doesn't really work on the computer every day, like how some things work. So there was a little bit of that. It's not until sometimes you get really involved in a project like this before you realize the things that no one ever thought of. So the testing, and which is why it's in beta now. The testing was really intense because we kept saying like, oh, well, this is a path we never went down before. So, that made it challenging, but it was a lot of fun. It was fun working with everyone, and it's a really neat idea. So I'm pretty happy with it.
Nice. And what tools did you use to manage all these different people in different time zones? How are you kind of pulling through requirements from the like initial brief that seems like it was a little bit loose?
Yeah,
and then
it was
kind of
really,
managing the project.
Really loose. Yeah. And there wasn't a whole lot of extra money to spare, which will tie in nicely with what we're talking about today. I didn't have a ton of hours that I could spend on doing a lot of things. I had to be really picky with what I was doing and what I wasn't doing because I didn't want to blow the budget on my hours. I wanted to save as many hours as possible for the actual development. So we used Slack. Because it was free. We used Trello because it was free, and we used a lot of Google Docs because they are free. So we needed to, figure out how to make all of those work for us with none of the paid features because we needed to be as lean as possible to really get this moving for this woman in this project.
Interesting. And how did you find this project? Was this just like a friend of a friend reference? Because it sounds like a startup. It sounds like
no. Well, you know me. You mentioned that I'm on Slack all the time, and your Slack is not the only Slack that I'm on all the time. I'm constantly looking for, as a freelancer, you have to keep making sure that your lines of communication are open with everyone so that you can get as much information in as possible. So I talk to a lot of people about a lot of things. I can't even remember off the top of my head the long string of events that brought me to that project, but it was a lot of like, oh, hey, I think I know a person that I might have heard from this other place. And does anyone know if anyone does this? And it was probably a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, I do a lot of networking. So things come to me in really strange ways.
Yeah. So did you pull together the project team? Was that something that you did?
No, I didn't. I was kind of put into a pool of people, and we just kind of figured out what everybody was going to do. So I didn't have to find the resources for that one. But I was really happy with the team that I was put on, and I'm going to be, communicating with them in the future, and hopefully we'll all get to work on a project again because I really did appreciate what everybody brought to the table.
Yeah, that's cool. I think it's always interesting, working on these kind of projects where, sometimes the client might not be as savvy, but it also often means that there's a lot of flexibility as well.
Yes.
And which is an awesome thing, having a client who trusts you, doesn't really know what they're doing, but it's like, sure, you guys are the experts, just tell me what we should be doing. And it's like, this is nice.
Yes.
You can do a lot of the right things. The downside is you get that pain of, okay, try pressing Control F5.
There was a lot of that, yes. There was a lot of that. But you know what? It's good to remember that, especially when you're making an app for the general masses, not everybody is coming from the same level of knowing how to do things. So it actually was good in a way that we had to go back to basics. Because we had to remember we had to go back to basics with the actual app too. We couldn't just take for granted that people understood that, if you used your finger to scroll, you'd be able to see the rest of the form. We needed to make it clear that you needed to scroll. So it actually worked out well for this project.
Yeah. Good stuff. Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's talk about you mentioned it and I was talking about it earlier, but we were chatting on Slack about the truth about how we actually manage projects. And I think on one side, there's the theory, and yeah, like I said, on the Digital Project Manager, we publish lots of articles about how we should do how we should run projects, or the right way that, best practice that we can implement on our projects. But I thought it'd be interesting for us to talk about the actual truth, or the reality of how we manage projects in the day-to-day, when there's so many things to do, especially if you do things particularly if you've got some proper project management training, like a PMP, and the PMBOK, and all of the kind of processes and the workflow that you should be adopting, and you've got all these different registers and status reports, and it becomes just one big administrative nightmare. And I think the truth is that we are always overloaded, and there's always kind of documentation that you could be updating, or that you could be things that you could be doing. But yeah, I thought it was interesting to talk about, are we doing things because they're the right things to be doing, or are we spending too much effort on the wrong things? And so we kind of, talked about just a second ago, this idea of like stop, start, continue. What should we start doing? What should we be stopping doing or reducing doing? And what can we continue doing? I'd be interested to hear your kind of perspective on, like, starting at the high level, what the non-negotiables are. What are the kind of, when you first arrive on a project, maybe even like the one that you were just talking about, what are the kind of things where you're like, okay, at a very minimum, I have to make sure these things are sorted. Otherwise, this project's just gonna grind to a halt or go off the rails before we've even started.
For me, it's always timeline and requirements, and then bringing up the rear is budget. And budget is important in different ways to different projects. But timeline, I don't think you can ever get away from having a timeline, a fairly detailed timeline. And you really can't get away from requirements, because otherwise you have no idea what you're doing, and your team won't have any idea what they're doing. So those are the two things that absolutely you must have, in my opinion. Those are the non-negotiables.
And so just to be clear though, so when you're talking about requirements, you're not talking about a statement of work, you're talking about, what format are those requirements in then? Well,
that's a good point, because they don't necessarily have to be in a document, but knowing what the scope is, and what even beyond the scope, one step beyond scope into, what does this thing have to do? So if I look at a statement of work, it does usually take some things for granted. Not everything is outlined in the statement of work. And there's going to be another layer of things that have to be done or talked about or considered, or features that need to happen in order for the scope to be realized. Those are the things I'm talking about. They have to be defined. People need to know what they are. It's going to drive what people do. Otherwise, you really have no idea what you're building. So those are the types of requirements I'm talking about.
I think that's so true. The estimate, well, for me, it's estimate, timeline, statement of work. When I'm first kind of landed on a project and you're kind of level setting, those are the bits of documentation I'm trying to find, because if you don't know the timeline, if you don't know the requirements, there's no way that you can manage and control the project. So if you don't know how it's supposed to be, you don't know whether or not.
How will you know if it's done? How will you know if it didn't? Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that's typically, though, the things that are when you inherit a project is one of the things that you tend to find that it's kind of always slightly out of date by the time that you receive it, particularly around the requirements or the statement of work. It's like, oh yeah, well, we chatted about that, and we agreed to do something different,
right.
or something like that. So level setting on that. So how do you, if those are the kind of non-negotiables, how do you kind of maintain those throughout the project to make sure everyone's on the same page with them?
I remind people of the timeline each week or each time we get together to talk about the project. Maybe it'll be more than once a week. Maybe it'll be every 2 weeks. It really depends on the project. But I will always remind people where we are in the timeline, what is our next deadline, and usually what the deadline is after that. So we know what we're working toward. Remind them of what the end date is, what we're driving toward, not necessarily the launch date, but usually this is when we have to be in QA or this is when we have to be in UAT. So I'll remind everyone about that. And if that changes, I will always let people know. Or if we're in danger of missing something, that's when people will hear from me the most. And as far as requirements, I do try to keep those updated as much as possible. It's nice when they're back on a Kanban system like Trello or something where you can, or even Jira, where you can continue to talk about what something should be and you can see how things evolve and, what is the latest thing that we said we would do for this feature. And all that can be composed in one area and searchable so you can figure that out. So keeping those up to date, if that's how you're working, if you're not using those types of things, then it's keeping some sort of documentation up to date with, things that you've decided with the client, things that you've decided to save time or things that you need to add on later on. So it's a constant, updating of the documentation that you have, whatever state that's in.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for me, often I'm writing a statement of work and then I'm issuing change requests or I'm issuing updates to the statement of work, which is typically like a Word document. Every time there's a pivot on the project, just so that I've got a client's signature on, hey, yes, I know, I understand that we're making this change and I'm approving it. Because that whole, the paper trail of keeping track of, especially if you've got multiple clients or there's some confusion over who's really in charge of the project, having some record of that, I think, can be really important.
Absolutely.
But let's go on then to talk about some of the things. So if those are the kind of non-negotiables, our statement of work or our requirements, our timeline, our estimate, let's talk about some of the things that we were talking about that actually maybe we don't have to go to town on, or we don't have to over engineer. So one of the things that you talk about in the article is detailed budget and project breakdowns. Do you want to talk a bit about?
Yeah. My background, where I started, there was a lot of like, this is exactly how everything works. And I was a cog in a very large wheel, with lots of other project managers doing lots of things. There were many of us and we all needed to do everything the same way. So there was a lot of like, this is how things are done. And it wasn't until I started working for smaller agencies and then going freelance where I was like, well, you can't always do all of those things because, it's going to be really tough to, keep your budget intact if you do it and you might not have the time. So, when I was at that larger agency and we were doing, all the things that you must do, one of them was a really detailed budget. And it was old school. I still do my budgets pretty old school. I put them in a spreadsheet. And I would have like pivot tables and I'd have conditional formatting and I'd have like cells referencing other cells and the percent done and, what was left to do and versus this budget and how far off are we from our projections. And the projections were done weekly by role. Like it's pretty robust. And that, for the most part, that serves me really, really well because I can answer any question at any time if I keep that detailed of a budget. But if keeping that detailed of a budget requires me to use a lot more hours of my time, and it's not something that the client cares about, it's not something that whoever's signing your paycheck, if it's not the client, your agency or whoever you're working with, if you're subcontracting, you need to make sure that what you're putting out there is what is needed. So for me, it would be not having as detailed of a budget and projection breakdown as I'm used to. So it took me a little bit of time to feel okay with that. But there is a level of reporting that you may not have to do. So my suggestion for people who are thinking, do I really need to be doing all this, is really to ask yourself, what do you need to be doing? How much of this do you need to be doing? Can you do less of it? Will it hurt your budget if you do more? Will it hurt your project if you do less? And figure that out, and not just do these large scale budget breakdowns out of a sense of duty, doing them more out of a sense of this is what's good for the project.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And so I'm interested though, as a percentage, do you, for your project management time, do you kind of set it as a percentage of the overall number of hours of the team that you're managing, or do you do it on a kind of per task basis typically?
Well, I used to do it on a percentage basis, and I found that when I was at larger agencies, this is this is the good side of having worked, first of all, for a really, really longer than people probably realize, because I'm old, but also having worked for a number of different places and having gone to a lot of different agencies and done a lot of different stuff, and not just worked one place for, 10 years or whatever. I have a lot of interesting background on all kinds of stuff. So, I used to do it as a percentage, and that works really well. If you have something that can absorb any of the stuff you didn't think about. So I could do a percentage if it meant that, I didn't have to think too much about how much, I was going to go over. But I found that I need to really look at each task. I'm pretty anal about doing estimates. I have a really strong point of view with them. I typically will look at the task breakdown of the entire project, and then if I'm going to do a percentage of time, I'll do it as a percentage of time of the task. I don't do like a bottom line percentage anymore, because I feel like that, for the smaller guys and, me as a freelancer, it's too, it's not targeted enough, to really kind of cover what I need to cover. So I don't do it as a percentage of the whole anymore. I think it's fine to do that. And if it works for you, you should keep doing it. But I've found for me lately, it wasn't covering what I needed it to.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay. So it wasn't enough. It wasn't that it was too much. It was that it wasn't you weren't having enough hours?
Yeah, I wasn't having enough hours, or,
really? What percentage were you using?
I was doing, so I was used to working with account managers then, and I was doing, I pushed for doing 20% of the whole to add for account management, and additional 20% on top of that for project management. And
okay, that is a lot.
It is a lot.
So 40%.
It is a lot, but it didn't always. You know what? That's the thing with a percentage. It doesn't account for everything. So the types of projects that I was doing, they weren't. And this is a whole can of worms that we're opening up. But if the bottom line of what's being charged isn't right to begin with, your percentage is meaningless. Right. So if someone hasn't priced it out well, then your percentage is still not going to be right. So I found that it didn't work well because I didn't have enough hours, but that's not only because I didn't have enough hours. It's usually because no one had enough hours, and it was just, completely not priced well. And, going back to making sure that your estimates are, you want to make money on the project. So it might not have been so much that the percentages were not working for me. It might have just been because the percentages were based on a number that wasn't right to begin with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, talking about percentage, so I'm used to working with, I'd say, project management should be 20% of the overall project costs, and then account management would be on top of that, but it wouldn't quite be as much as 20%. But I think the important thing here, kind of the takeaway, is that we talked about requirements, and there's kind of the requirements of the project, and for us tailoring our kind of detailed budget and projections, tailoring that based on the client that we're working for, and the fact that you don't need to go overboard and over engineer this. But I think there is also, it's in terms of the client's appetite and willingness to pay for it as well. So if you've got a highly risk averse client who wants to know the minute detail of buy resource, kind of breakdowns and how that's going to pan out across the whole project, then it's an education thing, isn't it? That to do that costs money. And I know there's some project management software that you plug in all these numbers at the beginning, and if the time tracking and the project, it's all integrated into one beautiful system, that it can do it all for you. But the reality is, for most of the projects that we do, it is a manual process. We get the timesheet hours from somewhere, we have to plug it into a spreadsheet and then do some calculations. So it's it's a big, expensive task. But then if you do go for this lighter route and you say, okay, well, we're not going to provide this detailed budget breakdown, how do you how are you making sure that you're staying on track? What's your kind of lighter method when you're not being that granular? How do you approach that?
Well, in my world, in the past, for example, I would have broken out the overall projection for the hours. Breaking down the budget into hours and projections for each role. I would usually, go through, put in actuals, and then adjust the projections for the rest of the project. And say, okay, well, I took too much this week, so I need to get that from somewhere. So my projections for these other weeks are going to change a little bit. Or I got that done faster, so I've got more, so I can adjust projections. That's the first thing I would cut out. If I knew that I didn't have enough time or, budget or bandwidth to be that robust with a budget, that would be the first thing to go. So you'd have your projections at the outset, and you would be able to see, where you were, but not necessarily adjusting every single projection each time you updated your budget sheet. So that would have been once a week for me. That actually took me quite a bit of time to figure out, how to do that. And the plus side of doing that means I'll know really early on where we're going to have trouble. And you can raise a red flag a lot sooner. But, that does take a lot of time, costs money for me to do that. So there are other ways that you can figure out red flags. So that would probably be the first thing to go. Having, all the calculations that I would do, to be able to slice and dice every single piece of information 5 different ways, that would be the next thing to go. And you go back to the basics of, are we on budget? Are we in danger of going over? Do we have enough hours left to do the things that we need to do? Does the percent complete look a lot like the percent used of the budget? Yes. Okay, great. Let's keep moving, and not making the spreadsheet or using the tool to its nth degree, and just focusing on the basics.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the things to note though is we're talking about how we scale our approach for different projects and different clients. But I think one important thing to note is if you are running a big project with lots of resources, that you just need to be aware, obviously, that your burn rate is going to be much faster on a project. So your ability to pivot, if you're burning through 50K worth of budget each week on just in half a week you spent 25K.
Right.
So I think we also need to think about how we're tailoring our on large projects, how we're monitoring that budget, and how we're reporting it is a different thing, but how the extent to which we kind of dive into those numbers needs to be kind of tailored to the overall budget as well. If you've got a much smaller team and there's only a few resources, the impact of leaving it longer before checking the data is obviously not as
right.
As bad.
I would still check everything every week. I just wouldn't go nuts with the analyzation of what I see. I would just kind of take it a little bit more at face value. And believe it or not, I've come across clients who, have, or contractors who have subcontracted to me. So there's a client and there's someone who's paying me who's not the client, and they're more of like an account manager, and they would have sold to the client something at a fixed bid and turned around and tell me, I don't really care what, here's your budget, but like, I'm not worried about if we go over. Like, okay,
Right.
Those are fantastic. But at the same time, you're sort of like, if you don't have parameters around something, it could go really nuts. And, whether or not he wanted me to put together a budget, I was going to put one together anyway, because it's really irresponsible of me not to. I need to be able to show what everyone's done in the time that they're doing it, even if he tells me money's no object, which sounds like a great thing, but it was actually a little bit anxiety producing for me, because I was like, how am I going to know if we're doing it right?
Well, and it's also nearly always misleading as well, because I think when people, when you hear those famous words, money is no object, or it's okay, I know we're going over budget, don't worry about it. We know. Like, there's a big difference between going over budget 10K and going over budget 100K or 500K.
Yeah.
Like,
after a while, it becomes like something you don't even notice. You don't even see it anymore. You could be so far over budget that it literally doesn't matter anymore. And then everyone just goes hog wild. It's awful. I've been on projects like that, and it's terrible.
Yeah. And then, once the point where the team's like, oh yeah, well, we went over budget 3 months ago.
So who cares?
And then people are just, throwing time on the project, and the situation's getting worse and worse. Like, as soon as your budget remaining is like at zero, it's like, well, do I start putting negative numbers into here? Like, someone needs to keep track of them. Okay. So we've kind of touched on like status updates, which is one of your points in the article around, how comprehensive should we make our status updates? I think typically, in a status report, which we send to clients, we tend to give them updates on this is the state of the budget. This is how much we've used this week. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. Planning to do next week. But then there's also other things that you can include in there as well, right? So like the budget kind of breakdowns and forecasts, like your risks and issues. You could throw anything to a status report. So how do you tailor that?
It's funny because I feel like sometimes the status reports that we do as project managers are we subconsciously feel like they're a reflection of the value that we bring to the project. So if your status update doesn't look robust, doesn't mean that you're not a good project. Like, I don't want anyone to ever say to me like, well, what are you doing with all these hours? Like, what are you even doing? And so I feel like sometimes we throw like everything into these status reports to show our value, that we're keeping track of all this stuff, or show the agency's value, that we're doing all this stuff. And, it takes a lot of time and effort to update that stuff, and you might not need it. My recent work that I did for that app I was talking about, the client, she was not super tech savvy. All she cared about was whether or not things were going well, if we were going to make the date that we said we were going to, and if we were waiting on her for anything. She just didn't want to be a bottleneck for anything. So most of the time she didn't even get on the status calls because she was, busy doing other things, and it really wasn't a priority for her. She just wanted to know those three things. Are we doing okay? Are we going to be on time like we said we were going to? Are we still hitting this date? And do you need anything from me? And so I was putting together these status reports, and I was like, why am I don't need to be doing this. I was doing like a whole section of what we got done last week and what we plan to do this week. And what, she didn't care about any of that. She, I like to think she trusted me, but I think it was more like she just didn't have time. But we'll go with she trusted me. She trusted me to make sure that all those things were working. And she just wanted to know that it was okay. Now, that is one type of client. And, there's tons of types of clients. So really the point here is to think about your client on this project and what do they care about, and don't fill it with other things just to kind of show your worth and say like, look at all the stuff I've been doing, or look at all the stuff we've been doing. And you can cut out probably a decent amount of stuff from your status reports if you really only focus on what they need or what they want.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice, particularly with, I think often when we start on a project, I'm guilty of this, like taking the last status report from the last project that we did, changing the client name and the date, and then like, oh, this was a good one, this went well, let's use this one. And then you realize that you added in all this kind of information and detail that the previous client requested, and you're like, yeah, that was quite useful, let's do that again. And you kind of end up with this bloated, sometimes status report. And then actually sometimes providing client either that, they're not interested in all the details, they just want to know everything's going okay or not okay. And we end up providing them with details that actually then we don't need to give them that information. So I think thinking about, okay, how do I strip this back to the bare minimum to start with? And if the client really wants more information, they can ask for it and we can add it, but being confident that, hey, this is all the information that we need to give them. And let's not spend hours. Like once it starts taking you hours to produce a status report, that should be a red flag that something's not quite right.
I've had clients ask me, you say like, wait until they ask you for something. I've had clients ask me for things, maybe a different way of looking at budget numbers or more information about some of the things that we were doing. And I've had to tell them, look, I budget my time for these status reports. And right now I spend, X number of hours a week preparing this stuff. If you do want me to continue like this, then we'll be fine. But if you want me to add something, that's going to add at least another hour, per status or half hour, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize, how many hours that will be over the time that we have left in the project. Are you sure that you want me to do that? And most of the time they'll be like, well, could you just do it one time and then we'll see if we need to keep doing it? Or, no, it's not that important to me. I just thought it would be interesting to know. And you can kind of talk people out of it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. Yeah. When you explain the consequence of asking of what someone's asking for, and just say, hey, so it'd be 1 hour, an additional hour a week for the next 25 weeks.
Are you sure?
Do you realize this is going to cost you $5,000? And then, oh no, it's not worth that much.
Exactly.
Okay, fine. Let's not do it then. I think the one caveat to this that I would say is, if you are working on a risky project, or you're working on a project and either it's a tricky client or that things could go wrong. I'd say one thing, rather than going down the kind of bare minimum route, I'd be elevating my risks in the status report, and I'd be trying to have an ongoing conversation about that, and so that what we don't want to be doing is going so light that we're not covering our ass, so that when projects go wrong, we're not just left out in the cold with no evidence that we'd ever said anything about this thing that might go
absolutely
wrong. And I think that can be...
Yeah, I feel like the rule of thumb for something like that would be you have to be very confident to remove it. If you have to be confident that you don't need it, or you have to be confident that you could go back and add it if you needed to, but your confidence level will either come with having worked with that client before, having worked on that type of project before, having worked as a project manager for a long time, whatever your level of comfort is for doing that stuff, let that be your guide. And, that will be helpful in helping you to make sure you don't cut out something you really do need.
Yeah, for sure. That'll be a warning. So next up, one of the things that you talk about, and I think this is a really interesting one, all of the Scrum ceremonies. So when we're doing Scrum, there are ceremonies, and that's what makes Scrum. And if you've done your Scrum Master training, this is what they do. You spend 2 days learning. It's about these ceremonies: sprint planning, Scrum, sprint reviews, retros. But then once you've scheduled all those into your project, particularly if you're doing a 1 week sprint, but even if you're doing a 2 week sprint, and then you're spending a day or 2 days of meetings of these different all this kind of planning and reviewing and ceremonies, it can take up a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
So your kind of suggestion is here is, hey, maybe you don't have to do all of them all the time, or you can merge them together.
Yeah, and I know people who are really, very Scrum centric. They get really upset if you suggest that you do something a little bit differently. But I think most, even I would say most certified Scrum Masters will say that they believe that you shouldn't do things that are not needed for a project. I think everybody can pretty much agree on that. I think it'll just be, whether or not they feel like these are the things. But if you're having like a backlog grooming session and that's over, and then you're doing a sprint planning session and that's over, and you're doing a sprint review and that's over, and they're on different days or they're at different times, or that can get daunting quickly if you don't have the budget for it. Again, a lot of this comes down to whether or not you have the time and the budget. If you have the time and the budget, go for it. But if you don't, think about putting these grooming sessions and planning and reviews all together. You could get a benefit from doing that by getting some momentum, by, instead of doing one and then, stopping and doing something else and coming back to that same project to do a planning session. You can actually take some of the momentum from a backlog grooming session and a review session to do a planning session that could be really, insightful, because you were just talking about, what happened before and what some of these things were in the backlog. So you could benefit from it. But, again, using your judgment, if it feels like you're spending 3 hours on something that could really get done, all three things in like 90 minutes or, an hour and 15, then, maybe you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, I think that suggestion that these don't have to all be separate things all the time, I think is really helpful. But particularly, and you touched upon this as well, in terms of retrospectives. Like when we're doing retros, like the idea is, this idea of continuous improvement, and we're constantly evolving the way that we do things and manage the project. That I think is helpful. But I think one of the things you mentioned in your article is about keep it light, like the retrospective thing. I know that I've been done retrospectives myself, where like you send out a survey to everybody, and then you collate the feedback, and then you draw some stats. Like 49% of people said that this project was a disaster. 25, and like, is that really that? Like, what are you going to do with that? Like after this moment in time, what are you going to do about it? So I think merging things together, keeping them appropriate to the disaster that's happened or not. Like sometimes we're doing retrospectives and then you're like, do you know what? This sprint was fine.
We're all good. Everything was great.
Like,
2 thumbs up.
Yeah, okay. And there's no need to be engineering these kind of reports. If like just move on. You don't need to spend another hour doing that. And I think we can sometimes get kind of caught up in the, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. Rather than being pragmatic about, hey, let's just get this project done.
It's either that or, if status reports make us feel like we're showing our worth to our clients and justifying our existence to our clients, retrospectives sometimes can make us feel like we're justifying our existence to our internal stakeholders or, owners of agencies or owners of companies. So, again, like we're saying with all of these things, just like ask yourself, how helpful is this going to be? And is it worth 5 hours of my work? Is it worth 2 hours of my work? Do I have 5 hours? Do I have 2 hours? Do I have 30 minutes? I've got 30 minutes. Let's just say whether or not we feel like this was a good, a good project or not. And if there was one glaring thing that was wrong, like let's identify that and move on.
Good stuff. So finally, let's just talk about kickoff meetings. And for me, this is a really interesting one. In your article, you suggest maybe you don't need to do a kickoff meeting. Maybe you can just send an email instead. So I find this really intriguing. this is not something I've ever done. But tell me, how do you make that work? Where so you're starting a new project, you've pulled together a team, everyone's been resourced, and then you just send people out an email to, this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
See you in a week.
How does that work? I know it sounds crazy, but this is something I started doing when I was working at a pharma agency, where we did a lot of the same types of projects across different clients. And, so it was, I wouldn't say it was formulaic, but, there weren't a lot of new crazy things we were doing for each, piece of collateral we were doing. This worked really well actually for print projects, because I did work on print projects for a while, believe it or not. But if the teams were almost always the same people, they were all assigned to the same clients, so they all knew their roles. That was one thing that I would do in a kickoff meeting, is make sure everybody knew their roles. Right. Everybody already knew their roles. There were 2 designers. There was always 1, developer. There were always, 2 account managers. Like, everyone knew what they were supposed to be doing. So we would all get in a room and would kind of be like, I have so much to do. I don't even have 30 minutes to, devote to this kickoff. So it was more like, okay, if everybody knows what their role is, and everybody knows who this client is, and everybody's worked on a project just like this before, what are the things that they need to know? They need to know what makes this different from the other projects that they did that are like this. So I'll outline those things. They need to know what the timeline is, which is something I'd bring to a kickoff anyway. And, I could talk about the timeline, but they want to see it and interact with it and look at it and be able to absorb it. So they're not really going to be able to give me, off the cuff feedback necessarily from looking at it at the meeting. And I want to give them, their first tasks. So I can do that in an email if everybody knows all the rest of it. And actually, they were really happy that I didn't take the time to make them sit there and talk about everything and hear me talk about the same things that they always did. So if you're doing projects like that, where they're very repeatable and you've got the same folks doing the same things, you might not have to do a kickoff meeting. You could do a kickoff email. I did them a lot, and it was really successful.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's. I can see that I can see that working. Yeah, when you are doing something repeatable. I think in my instance, I've always got someone new to the project, or there's some kind of new element. But I think similarly though, there's something where, if we're just thinking more generally about what are we doing because we always do it, rather than what you're talking about there is, what do people really need to know to be able to get started on the work? And I think one of the things where we sometimes spin our wheels a bit and over-engineer is like in writing briefs. And you're talking about here sending out an email with a brief in it, basically. But sometimes I think we get this brief template, and I think, don't get me wrong, I think briefs are really important and helpful. But there's often sections in there where you're like, oh, I have to copy and paste like the same thing again. I'm just changing 3 words. I did this last week, and it's the same kind of thing. Like, if you've just got the same team, I think looking at how you're briefing people and trying to make that briefing process more efficient as well, so that you're not spending your time when you're briefing people going over stuff that everybody knows, and it's a complete waste of time, and just focusing on, okay, people, here's what we're trying to do. Here's what I need you to do. Here's the kind of task that we need to get done. Is everyone cool with that? Like, not being formulaic about the way that we approach everything in this kind of like templated way. I think for me, the kind of takeaway from our discussion today is like, treat everything like a special snowflake. Like, don't think that you need to, just because you did a good job on something last time and you applied loads of effort on it, doesn't mean that you need to apply exactly the same process and documentation and rigor to every single project of every different type. The point is that we can do things differently. We don't have to do things exactly the same every time. Tailor it to the project.
Absolutely.
Cool. So, well, Patrice, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great having you with us. And if you'd like to contribute to the conversation that we've been having today, comment on Patrice's post or head over to the community section of thedigitalprojectmanager.com and join the conversation there. But until next time, thanks for listening.